Heading round the bend. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
My name is Dr. Amy Pason, and I'm an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Nevada, Reno.
fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us. Do people ask you all the time about the women?
The women, in
The
terms
first,
of,
the 1939 film.
oh,
It's
that was filmed in Reno?
well, it's set in Reno. It's probably filmed in LA, but it's the perhaps the only ever Hollywood film that only has an all-female cast, and all these gals are there to get quickie divorces.
Yes, I don't typically get asked that question personally, although we do like our history here in Reno, and I live in a neighborhood that has kind of old houses from the 1920s and 30s,
Ah,
but kind of they have the adjoining duplexes and triplexes that were for those women coming to Reno for those quickie divorces.
ah.
So
Oh, for years it was rumored that it was going to be remade with Julia Roberts, um, but it never happened. But if you get a chance, watch it. It's incredibly fun. The way they talk about the men is really interesting. I think it was directed by a gay Hollywood director, so because of course they wouldn't let a gal direct it. I'm pretty sure about that. It might have been George Cukor or somebody like that. But it definitely is this place where the gals can get together and engage in solidarity, sometimes engage in competitiveness, but always with the spectral figure of their pathetic husbands that they're escaping. Anyway, yes, so the divorce thing with Reno is part of the heritage, I guess. But it's got lots of other things going for it historically and today. And one of those, Prof, is you. And you're here to tell us all about it. And actually, my first question that I pose to everybody is to inquire what's currently impeding, preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing you? What's going on with the prof?
Yeah, so a lot of my work focuses on democracy and processes of democracy. And I've been seeing issues with the slide away from democracy and authoritarian towards authoritarianism in a whole lot of different areas. So we
Mm.
could look more nationally broadly with thinking about the Trump administration. We can think just in terms of how elections generally are run. Since I'm involved a bit in our local politics here, looking at the ways that, even our primary voting for our state offices or local offices often exclude if you're not part of a political party, for example. But I also see some of these slippages in terms of democracy, in terms of that concept of shared governance that we have at the university, and especially with deans and provosts, the folks that are in charge of making decisions who are happy to not have faculty involved in their actual workplaces. So, kind of both in my research life and my personal working
Yes.
life, thinking about democracy and that status is really kind of my main focus.
And sometimes it's great to blend the personal and the public, the private and the professional, the research and the activism. But when do you switch off? How do you switch off, Prof?
There are a lot of happy hours. We have a great bar and distillery scene here in Reno. But I think that's a key part, and again, this is sort of in that the activism and organizing that
Mm.
solidarity is really important as a concept. And sometimes solidarity means being on the picket lines or joining in on, we've had the No Kings marches, and Reno has been one of the cities that has had a very high turnout. I think one of our new No Kings marches, we had 18,000 that turned out, which kind of exceeds that. You need one third of your population in an area if you're going to turn the tide. And so we definitely saw that here. So solidarity just being with other people, but solidarity just in terms of those social spaces of gathering together, of sharing drinks with one another, and just that space to connect in the face to face, I think is important.
And you talk about a crisis of democracy. This is something that you can read about with reference to the United States in the New York Times almost every day. Even the New York Times is prepared to write about that. You can read about it in The Economist, you can read about it in the Financial Times, in terms of quite reactionary mainstream news outlets, nationally and internationally. People who are, center right Democrats, let's say, Democrats with a lowercase d, who are just horrified. And for them, it also speaks to the fact that so much of what we rely on is not just the Constitution, the laws, but actually Republican virtues with a lowercase r. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, if you could talk a bit about your work as an activist and as a scholar in terms of what makes democracy strong.
Yeah. So I think in terms of my research started with looking at women's social movements in particular, and so really concentrated on where rights actually excluded people from having seats at the table, and the ways that a lot of those women's movements, if we're talking about with suffrage, getting the right to vote, or a lot of the peace and anti-nuclear work that women were doing in the 1970s and 80s. It was trying to figure out those ways that you work around the norms of a system that you're excluded from to still get access to it. Somewhat like a computer virus, right? If you can sort of look at what the rules are in place and you can exploit those, that's how you can change some norms. So generally thinking just in terms of having a seat at the table, and certainly, consensus building, direct action movements that used a lot of deliberation processes as part of their structure. So both the thing that they use to get things done, but also to enact the practices and values that they wanted to see in the world. Those things combine. And so I think, again, some of the things in terms of those virtues or those norms and practices that I would like to see us return to more are some of the basic things that I teach in courses, which is how do we sit down with one another and deliberate? How do we, even something that may seem old fashioned or classical in terms of our education, we need to teach argumentation. What is the thing that you're trying to claim or prove or persuade us on? But you can't just say, because I said so. You have to back that up with reasons and arguments and data. And I think what we see with the slide towards authoritarianism or the slide towards folks who want to limit shared governance or democratic processes, it's the limit of providing those reasons, relying on data, inviting people to the table, right? Overtly excluding folks preemptively because you may not agree with them or you just don't want to engage or you don't want to be challenged. And so I think those are kind of the things that we need to be focused on building those skills, building that culture where we want to engage with others and
Mm, mm.
listen, and that it's a priority for us to be inclusive and give seats at the table for folks.
This is helping me to understand something that I've had as a thought, which is that people like Vance and Rubio and Trump are scaredy cats. That I don't mean this in a physical sense. I've no idea and I don't care. But I mean intellectually. The fact that they're so afraid of a serious dialogue about, as you were saying, goddamn numbers. What's happening, what's actually happening here, there, and everywhere, and what should be done about it. The minute they are presented with facts, they claim either there's no such thing as a fact or only they have the facts, but there is no serious debate. The other thing that comes to mind when you speak is Nancy Fraser's idea of the feminist counter-public sphere, picking up on Habermas and various long-standing traditions of feminist organizing that are very participatory, but also, if I've got this right, and you'll correct me, look for ways of finding a line that you can then give to the outside world as the position that manages then to engage in dialogue with the dominant perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where, again, if you are a white man in power, and again, if we go to our Vances and our Rubio, if you've always been in a position of power, you've never had to try to imagine what it's like to be the other, right? Or what it's like to
Mm.
not have power. And I
Right.
can't, there's probably a lot of authors that have written about this, but certainly racial minorities or women minorities, if you ask them to say, what do you imagine life to be like if you were in a male body? Or what do you
Mm,
imagine
mm,
life to be
mm.
like if you were in a white body, if you're a racial minority? That folks who are in those minoritized positions can have that answer, right? Because their very survival in society is that they have to understand how those in power work and think so that we can work in that system, right? And make claims that speak their language. If we use Kenneth Burke and identification as
Yeah.
a concept, right? We're not going to persuade them on facts, but we have to get them to see our position because we're speaking their language. And that's, I think, the space where, when we think about feminist counterpublics or counterpublic organizing, there's a lot of, in Michael Warner's terms, world making and poetic world making that comes from that, because you have to imagine different possibilities and you have to work within the norms and the dominant that you're presented with in order to crack open that space. And so if you get a Vance and you get a Rubio who are in those positions of power, the most damaging thing or the most frightening thing is having to imagine not having power, right? Or having to be confronted with something that would take away the power that they assume that they have and hold over others. So I think that that may be part of some of these dynamics.
And just for some folks who may not be familiar with them, Kenneth Burke is, I guess, perhaps the most famous rhetorician or scholar of rhetoric in the United States, certainly a foundational figure in the Anglo world. And Michael Warner, a sort of literary critic, literary historian, very important in writings on the foundation of the Republic, but also in terms of a queer counterpublic sphere,
Hmm.
a major contributor. And so I think that those things you're saying are very, very important. And that makes me ask you about rhetoric. You mentioned earlier learning to argue. What do you do when you're with somebody who won't argue with you and won't listen? By the way, this is a very live issue in Britain at the moment, where they're looking to topple their current prime minister. And one
Hmm.
of the criticisms of him is that he won't argue.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that this is sort of the trick that we use, but it's not really a trick. It's just really to getting us to think more about how we build relationships, and that a relational component is important in terms of democratic deliberation. I teach a class on facilitation, which is really just to get students to engage with one another and to talk about social issues, but we set up the structures in place, again, thinking about all of these consensus making, consciousness raising practices from social movements as part that have become part of facilitator practices with where people get lots and lots of money to be professional trainers of. I give this stuff for free in my classes as part of that. But in knowing that you have a safe space, and safe it just in terms of you won't be attacked by somebody for what you say, that the idea is not to win the argument or the debate or to show that you're right or to coerce others to believe your way and to have to get somebody to confront that their way is wrong. But really it's creating those conditions in a space where the goal is really just for mutual understanding of an issue and trying to find the different alternatives and to weigh out options for the pathway forward. Right. And that again is difficult and hard work. But if you go into a conversation, or apparently with Keir Starmer, that he doesn't want to debate because he doesn't want to try to have to grapple with the complexities of a policy position or something that isn't what he already holds or has reasons to stay in power to stay on message about that's a problem, right? But when we get with what other scholars have talked about as wicked problem issues, all social problems are wicked problems. They're complex. There's no one solution that will fix it. Whatever solution we attempt and we try now will have its benefits, will also have its drawbacks, and may also create other issues that we have to address in the future. And so when that is really our mission of talking with one another, right, we have some common cause to really try to understand perspectives of others. So instead of, sort of evaluatively asking, well, why do you think that? Like, clearly that's not a good idea, right? the way into that is to tell me what you think about that, and then tell me a little bit more about how you arrived at that, or what experiences you have that have led you to that decision. And usually once we get at some of that, we both see the humanity. We build a relationship with somebody else that we are probably connected to because of our community, but we also start to see that maybe there is some common ground, some gray area, some questions that we all have. And so that's really, I think, the approach, and that gets us, from dialogue and deliberation, and not this winner take all sort of argument culture that we see most often.
This brings me on to a co-authored piece of yours, which connects together threads of a special issue that you guys edited of the Review of Communication. And it's about a project of the Rhetoric Society of America. And it seems to me that this project, which obviously locates itself, or did, I don't know what its situation is now, on your campus, is an attempt to push rhetoricians into serious engagement with policy questions. Could you tell us a wee bit about that project?
Yeah, so the Rhetoric Society of America usually has a summer institute, and usually it's more traditional seminars that people take to get more learning in specialty topic areas. And we decided here at University of Nevada, Reno that we wanted to do something a little bit different, really do more engaged scholarly work as part of this. So RSA let us experiment with this. And at that particular time, as many universities face, there's always tension between the university, the gown part of things, and the town side of things, the city, especially as it's related to development, right? Campuses are often located in neighborhoods, and they have to expand, or they have to navigate the city's interest and needs versus their own needs as an institution. And so what was happening at this time is that the campus needed to expand, and the space that they wanted to expand to connect the campus to downtown Reno, which downtown Reno does have lots of casinos, some of them now abandoned, but they wanted to make that connection even more so. And so the city and the university wanted to expand south of campus more towards that downtown. Well, south of campus was a historic neighborhood, and so lots of historic homes were in that section. Lots of them needed repair, but that was the space that we bought up. So on the one hand, we wanted to expand and build something new for the university that the city wanted, but we were also losing something in terms of that historic neighborhood and that part of Reno's story. So it was somewhat of a fraught back and forth, and because of timelines that, there was people wanted to buy those houses and move them elsewhere to save the history, but then timelines wise, if people weren't going to move those houses, they just got destroyed. And so we were engaging in asking these questions about, what is the university's role, and how can we read and talk about the places and spaces in a way that informs the policy, right? It's not just a piece of land. It is a place that has some historical meaning to families. It is a place that people transverse. It is a place that has tensions in terms of its uses and why decisions are made as they were. And so we had scholars from around the country really kind of, again, sort of in an ethnographic way, as well as with a rhetorician's eye, looking at those places and really reflecting, and also bringing those perspectives, certainly perspectives of the unhoused in particular that were in that area, to city leaders. And then that was part of what we were publishing in that project.
Fantastic. Inevitably, that leads me on to a theme you've already touched on, which is academic governance, and the claim by many universities in the United States that faculty are jointly involved in managing the place. I worked for many years at NYU and many years in the UC. At NYU, it's private, and so the position of the Supreme Court going back decades is that the faculty are managerial employees, which means we can unionize all we like, but we can't engage. No one's obliged to engage in collective bargaining with us because we can't register as a union, because we are managerial employees. When I was in the UC years ago, the system saw the faculty, University of California, vote against unionizing because they got a deal with management, which was management does the money and you bastards can do everything else. In other words, you'll have pedagogic self-rule, appointments, promotions, and so on. All those efforts that were hard won are getting eroded really all over the world in terms of what faculty can do. And you've been a very prominent voice addressing these issues, both locally and nationally, and also getting your readers, your students, your colleagues to think about academic labor. So I wonder if you could tell us a wee bit about that struggle.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was writing some of my pieces as a grad student when there was a workers' strike at the University of Minnesota. And so that was with our ASME workers, so the healthcare workers, technical workers, lab workers, research workers that were at the institution, really looking at some of the same issues that we're facing today, inflation, cost rise. They need to have some pay that also matches that. And so it was really in trying to confront some of the identities that we have as workers on campuses, because I think for a lot of academics and maybe the imaginary that folks outside of universities have as well, that we're in a privileged position. We spend most of our time drinking coffee and reading works, and that we sometimes go in and we lecture at students and then we call it a day and write our pieces, right? And that there's this idea that what we're doing is not really labor, right? We're not in a factory. We're not, for most people, not physically doing hard things as part of that. And
Yeah.
so, because there's also this freedom that folks have, like I can, ask my department chair to schedule me for classes that meet on Monday, Wednesdays at a certain time, or that I have a lot of my own time to decide if I'm going to write today or I'm not going to write today and do my research, that we forget the ways that this work is still managed, right? And it only is when you have management, administration saying, you all can't do this. We deal with the money. You have no say in it. Or you can't actually ask for things like ADA accommodations or remote work because we make those policies. You just do your thing and don't worry about the rest of it. So there's this extent that we don't see ourselves as workers in this sense because so much of our work is not overtly managed. And it's only when it's overtly managed and we are given those guidelines on, no, you really do have to clock in at this certain time. You really do have to follow these rules that we start to see the cracks in that. And so where shared governance comes in is that, again, we assume that a faculty member gets to teach the course that they're assigned the way that they want to, and it's shared governance because we've decided what those courses are that students are required in our departments. But when it comes to some of these other aspects, shared governance goes away, right? You don't have the ability to voice or have a vote on policies that affect the day-to-day in your campuses and your departments. You really can't do things like collective bargaining. You really can't grieve if you've got a boss that is bullying you because that's not in the narrowed areas that we've defined grievances
Right.
procedures to
Right.
be. And so that's where, again, some of Seth Kahn, who's at Westchester, he and I have written together and worked on some of these issues together. So really kind of grappling with, breaking down that we aren't this kind of higher class of folks that don't have worries or cares and manage our own lives, but that really what we're doing at universities is in this labor frame, right? It is part of structural conditions. It is part of thinking about issues of power and management, and that it's only by making arguments in that frame that we can have a say in our actual working conditions. I've gone without having an actual office, even though I'm a tenured professor, because I don't have a choice in some of those types of decisions, for example, right? And, again, little things like that do matter in the ways that I can engage with my students and actually complete my work.
One of the things that private and to a lesser extent nowadays public universities do is to claim that graduate students are not workers, even though they provide everything from, in inverted commas, menial tasks to incredibly complex ones. I gave evidence before the National Labour Relations Board on behalf of striking graduate student workers being represented by the UAW, Union of Automotive Workers, I think it's still called that, but which basically represents all kinds of precarious labor. Right? And I did so with a colleague. I had tenure. He was up for tenure. He didn't get it.
Mm.
And NYU had actually lost a law case, which he took against them, and they had to give him a payout. But it was clear that I had a certain protection, and he did not, in speaking out in favor of these people. And so it's just a small example, but these places also operate as cartels. All the big private universities use the same fancy law firms when they run into difficulties. And lots of state schools use the state legislature as a shield to do the things they want to do that involve more and more control. At the same time, of course, we do see situations, Texas is one, where legislatures or houses of government, gubernatorial mansions, are run by the Republican Party, and they're trying to intervene absolutely top down from the state house to the classroom. So there's that element as well. Sometimes it's about private or public schools not wanting to give faculty power or wanting to take it away. But sometimes it's about supervening authorities that want to meddle in a way that never really happened before. There was a relative authority, a relative autonomy. Have you seen that sort of shift, or am I making it up?
I think there is a shift, but I think it's history repeating in some sort of sense.
Okay,
So
yeah,
we can think about when Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the 1960s, and this is where kind of the anti-communists, you have to sign an oath that you're not a communist in the California schools is part, and the free speech movement is also kind of part in this moment of we don't want students to advocate on political issues and they can only table at certain places. This was kind of the free speech movement, the initiation of what many University of California, Berkeley students were occupying for. So I think it's just a different version of, if on the one hand we see universities as this microcosm of what happens in society, but we also see public education as this space where we want to imbue the norms that an educated public should have to be successful in government, as citizens, engaging in our communities, in business, that in part what we're doing in our classes is, sure, I'm going to teach somebody how to make a public speech, but we're also talking about values of democracy and why it's important to ask questions and to engage in things in a
right,
certain way.
right.
And so I think it's that aspect that then is threatening to people who don't hold those same views. They see the norms being developed as antithetical to their aims, right? That, Reagan was worried about hippies in the 1960s. Republicans in the US are now worried about DEI and woke issues and actually getting people to use data and value data and think about these things, because it then makes it hard for them to control or to assert their hegemonic power in particular ways, right? We don't want to teach histories of diverse individuals in the US because the great man history is nicer for some folks and doesn't make them uncomfortable. And so that's where I think some of these things like we see in Texas and Florida with actually changing curriculum is all in this effort of power more so than anything else. But seeing that there's a threat when we try to constitute communities and values in ways at our campuses that are antithetical to the powers that be.
You're mentioning Reagan makes me think of the fact that he tried to get Herbert Marcuse sacked from the University of California, San Diego, for his politics. And this was after Brandeis had denied Marcuse tenure back on the East Coast. Marcuse, of course, had been a spy or worked in intelligence services for the United States during the war, but nevertheless was clearly disloyal. So yes, just to back up your point, Reagan, back when I was a child, was absolutely in the vanguard of this sort of interference. And in terms of your right to speech as a faculty member, I've had some mostly junior faculty, mostly in southern states, southeastern states, whom I've been recording with, ask me since Trump returned to power not to ask them about politics, not to ask them about the university, because they're afraid. And I've had some faculty tell me that, for, one professor at a very famous Midwestern school who teaches about the history of slavery, who has been obliged statutorily to give both sides of the debate. And of course, there are many aspects to many debates about slavery, but this is clearly saying there was some good things about slavery being
Right.
reported of him. This is kind of new, isn't it?
I think it's much more overt that these discussions are coming into the classroom, and I think that part of the issue is that there's been so much, you know, uh, you know, people need to take advantage of disasters when they happen to get their way, right? I think that's sort of a line of what happens when crises take advantage of the crisis, and we've had so many financial crises in the US and the world over the past 16 years or so, right? The recession that took away from public education budgets, then COVID took away from public education budgets. Now we have whatever the Trump administration is currently doing to mess up our economy by starting wars, that's taking out of education budgets and other budgets. And so, that sort of crisis, even though, previous to the recession, there were universities finding ways to lessen their costs in terms of actually full-time faculty and tenured faculty, and that we know that the amount of money that states were given to public education in the U.S. decreased exponentially since the 1970s. And so those processes were already in place, but then these financial crises ramped them up. So we're seeing less tenure track positions. We're seeing more non-tenure track full-time lectures, but you look at the contracts and technically their contracts are year to year, even though they're regular and we assume that they'll get renewed, right? But it's kind of all of these steps that means that there's more precarity and so more concern that what I say today, I don't have protections of tenure. There isn't due process that faculty have been part of creating that would protect somebody's job. There isn't the way to push back on state legislators who want to dictate what's taught in the classroom if our very budgets and the amounts that we are able to be paid come from that same state legislator. But at the same time, we can't just rely on private or business grants to run a university because that comes with its own trade-offs of what we can actually research and what they're willing to pay for a return on investment, right? So it's kind of all of these things coming together. So I think it's, at least in terms of what we can actually teach and say in the universities, I think there is more precarity and
Mm.
fear about losing one's job. And certainly, if you're in a state where these are less of an issue, you don't want to lose your job here because there's fewer and fewer states that you might feel comfortable in moving to, because of some of these issues or taking away rights in other ways in other states.
Prof, I want us to go back in your past, not too far, because there's another very important aspect to your research, which is about violence, criminality, and also the complex relationship between uses made of the alleged nexus between the First and Second Amendments to the Constitution. I wonder if we could start with that topic, First and Second Amendments to the Constitution. Probably everybody listening knows the First Amendment is that governments should not pass legislation or take action that restricts speech. They may not be so familiar with the Second Amendment, which has cost many more lives.
Yeah, I mean, for listeners in the US and abroad, you know that the US likes our guns, and we like our guns because we have the Second Amendment that protects our right to have guns, which, given the Supreme Court's changing opinions on that, it used to be that we just wanted to have the right of a well managed militia to be able to have guns. And again, historically, this made sense when there were rebellions and reasons that communities may need to arm themselves to self-defend. But that conservative Supreme Court justices have now said that it really what we mean by the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is that anyone should be able to have a gun for individual self-defense, and that this individual self-defense, depending on which state you're in, can be anything from you certainly have the right to shoot somebody that comes up to your front door, and stand your ground if you feel scared. So not necessarily a great way, and also that we don't want to limit the kinds of guns that folks have because that would be a limit somehow on rights. So machine guns and automatic weapons are a-okay because you have the right to be able to buy and purchase the type of gun that you want, is the general reasoning. But I think again the conflation or trying to look at the intersection between the right to speech and this Second Amendment right has been part and parcel with some things that have happened in the U.S. Here in Nevada, there was the Bundy family who didn't want the federal agents to come and take their cattle that were illegally grazing in public lands because it was their right to do so, and so they had an armed standoff. This was down in the around the Las Vegas area, and then the sons of that family went on to occupy a wildlife refuge in Oregon that might have made some news, and somebody actually died in that standoff. But the arguments that were coming about at that time, as well as arguments that were coming with state legislators across the country who were arguing that there needed to be more concealed and carry permits or open carry availability for, again, anybody who wanted to have a gun with them at all times should be able to do that, and they should not be restricted on where they went. So you can take your gun to church, you could take your gun to schools, you could take your guns to the grocery store. That people who are very, emphasizing the Second Amendment wanted these things. So we're having some conversations both in terms of where is the line between public safety and these guns all about, but that arguments then, especially with the Bundys, is they claimed that they were protesting. Protesting is protected with the First Amendment. They just needed to do so with guns, otherwise no one would listen to them. The federal government wouldn't listen unless they had their guns. And this spins into these arguments that people need to use their Second Amendment rights to protect their First Amendment rights. And so then we have to ask whether or not guns and the presence of guns and the presence of possibly being killed might actually chill speech, right? People will be less apt to speak out or use those rights. And certainly as they cross into debates in terms of should we have concealed carry weapons at universities or in schools, right? Is the presence of a gun in a classroom going to be something that will chill speech in terms of what we teach, what we say? Should I be worried that a student who gets a grade they didn't like have a gun that they bring into my office? And so this is where, again, in certain patterns that we have, that these two rights then are in conflict, and we have to make arguments about whether or not it's more important to prioritize the First Amendment or the Second Amendment. And obviously, somebody is a rhetorician. I prioritize the First Amendment. We need to talk about these things and deliberate and be able to know whether or not this is really the thing that we want to do. And again, we can argue whether or not we have too many guns in the U.S. Probably so. So whether or not the Second Amendment and how it's been interpreted is the right interpretation, we can also debate that, I think.
This also relates inevitably to some of your work connected to criminology and to the law, more specifically with relation to violence. You've been involved collaboratively in looking at the difference between criminologists, nice liberal people, and the general public, nasty illiberal people, as it were, in terms of attitudes to crime. This is a very big issue in the United States because, like Iran and China, the country loves to lock people up. What's your take on all of that?
I mean, this is where we start to see the tension between education and the prison industrial complex. And again, because I spend some time at our state legislature and lobbying, and we care about budgets where that happens. We know that in our state, because it's in law that within our state budget, they have to pass the budgets for K-12 education first, right? And they can't pass any other budgets until we deal with our elementary and high school education. Then, of course, public safety, so all of our police and prisons and so on and so forth. And then after they get through all of the other state services, at the very end is where they figure out what's left over for higher education. And we know that they balance the budget in our state on higher education. So I have been lucky enough to receive numerous furloughs and pay cuts when we've had bad budget years because I'm a state employee. And so, yeah, when we think about, why we're concerned about crime or we're thinking about crime in prisons, it's that there's as we see more and more with a lot of our public services, they're all becoming privatized. And so it is a business, right? Part of capitalism is the fact that people can profit off of setting up a prison, contracting with states who pay them to operate these systems. And so when we are asking questions about the death penalty and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can't ask those questions except for thinking about the societal costs, right? It costs more to keep somebody on death row than it does to give them a life sentence where they can have parole. But why would we want to make sure that somebody stays in prison longer and we're spending lots of money on that because there's somebody that's profiting on the other end? Um, and of course, if we think about universities as doing the research that might inform policy, and sometimes that it does, then those opinions of experts and whether or not experts get listened to becomes an important question.
Absolutely. Now, my last query, Prof, somewhat relates to this. It's also about violence. It's about a particular piece of legislation connected to a tragic death, Schuyler's Law, and you have been critical of the way in which, let's say, the legislation and debates about it and debates about the whole story are framed. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, including perhaps a bit of context for some listeners who may need it.
Yeah, so this was a collaboration with a colleague of mine here, and he does research on Amber Alert laws. And Amber Alert was based off of Texas law that a young girl was kidnapped, and that, had there only been a public announcement, and so people get these alerts on their cell phones now, that there's be on the lookout for this car or this person who we believe to be kidnapped. So these Amber Alerts go out so that the community can get involved in trying to help rescue or find or help the police in finding missing children.
Right.
And his critique, and it was kind of in a conversation, he was like, I just don't like that these laws are being passed or they're expanded or they keep being used and they keep getting named after another kid in a different state and they don't actually do anything, right? The chances that you on your cell phone get this Amber Alert and you are at the right place at the right time to see this right vehicle is pretty minimal. So his critique was just like, I can't believe they keep passing these laws. Why is that? And me as the rhetorician, I was like, well, we should look at the deliberations that happen in state legislatures. And that's where when we, sort of see it's not really a deliberation that occurs. We're not looking at expert opinions. We're not looking at data. We're not looking at probability,
Right.
that these are really laws that are passed to make people feel good and assume that something is being fixed when nothing is really being fixed. And not that we don't want to have stories or think about the personal impacts of the legislation that we have, but we have to balance those types of things out. So, the piece is looking at these things that are critical. And in the particular case that we were writing about in with Schuyler's Law, it wasn't a kidnapping. It was that this girl's friends took her out into the middle of nowhere and killed her. Which is now, I think, another made-for-TV true life crime thing on some streaming service that they talk about this case. But the law itself, just some minor fixes to some technicality issues with the way that the state was doing their Amber Alerts wouldn't have saved Schuyler. It isn't addressing the actual cause of her death, right? Which is a much more complicated problem in terms of kids in their relationships and bullying that goes too far. And so that's what we wanted to try to also raise is that we need to have more serious conversations about causes and consequences of crime instead of things that make us feel good that will easily pass a legislature.
Wow. Wow. I've always been fascinated by this business of these named laws. It really feels like signaling one's virtue in legislatures to me. I wonder if there are some loved ones who do not cherish this use of their bereavement. Perhaps there are some who do. Prof, a last question. I'm wondering if there's something you'd like to add that might take the form of going over terrain we've already covered, where you want to say something more, or it may be that there's material that we haven't addressed where you want to offer something.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that we've kind of veered into the gun pieces and the violence pieces because I think that's also a big question that I'm grappling with at the moment in some of my work. And I was at a conference last summer where one of the presenters was talking about bellicosity, not a word that's usually used in normal everyday conversation, but he particularly used that word because bellicosity is not just that people are aggressive or that we see more instances of violence, but bellicosity is when people are apt to and they intend to, right? Their motivation is to engage in fights and violence. And so I think, again, when we're putting this into the context of democracy, you know, the ideal of being able to deliberate and to use argument in the way that Aristotle wants us to arise at some contingent truth that is to replace violence as a way for our societies to function, right? As I kind of tell my students, right, the reason that we're learning argument is because this is what takes us away from just beating each other over the head with clubs to get our way. We're going to actually use our words instead. But I think we see now more so in our general public sphere as people are engaging on social media or that we see as our examples from our leaders, again, Trump being a good example, is that is a much more bellicose sphere. We've given up on trying to deliberate, or that there's actually ways to quell deliberation or to limit the data that we have so that this direction towards violence is now the norm or is trying to be the norm of how we engage with each other. Again, I look at these issues because I want to try to find our ways out of it. And so that's why I think it's important for us to continue to really emphasize engaging in hard questions with our students of trying to get folks to see why people believe the way they do and to understand different perspectives because that's the path that takes us away from seeing everybody as someone to hit over the head with a club, I think.
I can only guess how wonderful it must be to sit in one of your classes, Prof. Thank you so much for your generosity in your research and your activism and what you've also shown us today.
Well, thanks for having me.